Hello, and welcome back to Mammalian Anatomy at Keuka College. We're continuing our discussion about Chapter 13, the Central Nervous System, and here we're going to talk about Part 2, the spinal cord. In this video, we're going to focus on the structure and function of the spinal cord. So we're going to talk about the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, what the spinal cord would look like if we dissected a human cadaver. And so just as a trigger warning, there will be images of human cadavers in this presentation, so just a heads up. We will also look at the sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. So what would the spinal cord look like if we took a transverse cross-section of it and looked at the cut end? We'll discuss spinal nerves. And lastly, we'll look at how the spinal cord is protected. Many of the same features that protect the brain are going to also protect the spinal cord with a few variations. So let's get into it. So what is the spinal cord first and foremost? The spinal cord is a collection of neurons that are going to travel up and down the spinal column and connect the peripheral nervous system and the brain. So one of the functions of the spinal cord is to innervate the body, anything below the head. So it's going to innervate sensory and motor neurons, and so it's going to help process that information. In previous videos, we talked about how there are two types of nerves that exist in the body. There are cranial nerves and spinal nerves. Cranial nerves originate from the brain and are primarily going to be responsible for innervating the face, the head, and the neck. There are a few exceptions that it will actually enter the torso itself. But most of the innervation is going to be responsible for, sorry, let's start that sentence over again. The rest of the body, inferior to the head, is going to be innervated by the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves will originate from the spinal cord and be responsible for carrying sensory and motor innervation information there. It's also going to be responsible for two-way conduction. It's going to connect the body and the brain and carry information up and down the spinal cord. In future videos, we're going to look at descending pathways and ascending pathways. Descending pathways are going to connect the brain to the peripheral nervous system, and it's going to carry motor information and stimulate the body to move. And ascending pathways are going to connect the peripheral nervous system to the brain and will carry sensory information. And so it will help us process our external and internal environment. The last thing that the spinal cord is going to be responsible for doing are reflexes. These are pre-programmed responses to specific stimuli, and we covered reflexes in Chapter 12. So if you would like to review reflexes and its components, please see those videos in Chapter 12. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. So what would the spinal cord look like if we dissected a cadaver? So the spinal cord so let's look at this diagram. So here in this diagram, what we have done is we've actually cut the vertebrae to expose the spinal cord, and we're going to discuss different regions of the spinal cord. Here we can see the posterior view, and here we can see the lateral view. We're not going to talk so much about the curvature that develops in as the spinal cord or as the vertebrae form, so don't worry too much about the structure or the diagram at this lower region. So the spinal cord is actually going to start at the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is the hole that is the largest hole that is found in the skull, and the spinal cord will actually go through that hole. and it will actually meet with the medulla oblongata at that level. The spinal cord will travel down the vertebral column through the vertebral foramen, and the spinal cord will actually stop at L1 and L2 vertebrae. It does not go the full length of the vertebrae, so it won't go all the way down to the coccyx. Rather, it's going to stop right here in the lumbar region. That has to do with how the vertebral column develops. So we're not going to go into the details of that, but if you would like to learn more, your textbook does go into that in a more detail, more depth. Over here, what we can see at the end of the spinal cord will actually form a cone shape. We call this cone shape the conus medullaris. And a nerve fiber will actually travel all the way from the conus medullaris and kind of thread through the vertebral column, through the sacrum, and all the way down into the coccyx, the tailbone. And this thread, you can see here in kind of green, is called the filum terminae. It's going to be the final filament, and the purpose of this filum terminae is to anchor the spinal cord in place so that the spinal cord doesn't move around too much, and it will stay in place and not get damaged. Another structure that we can see is that coming off of the spinal cord is where you can actually see the spinal nerves. And for the most part, the spinal nerves will branch off laterally. But because the spinal cord ends at L2, what will happen is the spinal nerves lower than L2 will have to thread through the vertebral column and then exit out at a lower portion or inferior portion of the spinal column. It will create this almost fan-like or hair-like structure, and the name of this structure is called the cauda equina. Equina comes from equine, and in Latin that means horse, and we learned that cauda means tail. So this kind of fan-like structure of spinal nerves is called the cauda equina, the horse's tail. We can see the cauda equina a little bit better in this diagram. We see that the spinal nerve ends, or the spinal cord ends at L1 and L2, and the spinal nerves will actually have to travel more caudally or inferiorly to be able to leave the spinal cord or the vertebrae in a particular region. So just so that you know. Two other features that I would like you to be familiar with the gross anatomy of the spinal cord is the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. The cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargements are going to be widened areas of the spinal cord, and they have to be larger because they will accommodate more nerves that are going to innervate the limbs. The cervical enlargement is going to have the cell bodies that are going to innervate the arms, while the lumbar enlargement is going to have the nerves that are going to innervate the legs. So these have to be a little bit larger to accommodate those nerves. So that's the gross anatomy of the spinal cord. Here we're seeing that same diagram that we talked about before, and here we're going to see a little bit what the cadaver looks like. So if we actually dissected a cadaver and looked at the spinal cord, this is what it would look like. We can see the cervical, oops, where is my cursor? The top part over here is going to show the cervical portion of the spinal cord, and so you can see that the spinal cord will come from the foramen magnum, the largest hole of our skull, and it will connect directly to the medulla oblongata. And so we can see that the spinal cord is coming down. It's a bit enlarged here to form the cervical enlargement. And you see the spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord. A little bit lower here, we're seeing the thoracic region of the spinal cord. The thoracic region isn't going to be as enlarged because you're not going to have as many nerves branching off of it, because it doesn't have to accommodate for the nerves that are going to the limbs. Here, this is the most inferior portion of the spinal cord. This will be around L1 and L2. Over here, you can see the spinal cord, and it's forming almost a cone-like structure. This is the conus medullaris over here. And there will be a filum terminate that will be going down. So you can see that one right here. That will travel down all the way to through the sacrum and through the coccyx and be able to anchor the spinal cord in place. Here you see the spinal nerves that will actually create the cauda equina, like a horse's tail or like a ponytail. All right. Let's talk about the spinal nerves a little bit more. So there's actually going to be 31 pairs of spinal nerves. There's going to be 8 pairs of cervical nerves that are going to kind of branch off of the neck, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral. So here are the lumbar ones, 5 sacral, and 5 coccygeal, so going to the coccyx. And these nerves are actually going to form pairs. Normally what I would have you do in lab is be able to count them out and identify which nerve I am referring to. We're not going to be able to do that as easily because we don't have the models in front of us, but I do want you to be able to be familiar at how we would count it out. For the cervical nerves, the first cervical nerve is actually going to start above C1, and the rest of the nerves will be coming out of the intervertebral foramen. And so here would be C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, all the way down to C8. C8 is going to be below the 7th cervical vertebra. For the thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves, the nerve is always going to be inferior to the vertebra that it's numbered after. So here is the T1 vertebra, and here we have the T1 spinal nerve. 2, 2, 3, 3, so on and so forth. The same goes for lumbar. Here is the L1 lumbar vertebra, and over here we have the L1 spinal nerve. Same goes with the sacral. S1 vertebra, S1 spinal nerve. These will, for the most part, go through the intervertebral foramen or be part of the anterior sacral foramen. The spinal cord is actually divided into segments, and the segments are named based on the spinal nerve that arises from that region. And so, for example, the region that creates the C2 spinal nerve will be called the second cervical segment of the spinal cord. It is important to note that because the spinal cord doesn't go through the full length of the vertebral column, the segments of, let's say, the sacral and coccygeal will actually be more superior than they are where the spinal nerve actually exits. So let me kind of show you an example of that on this diagram. So let's say, so here we have, for example, a cervical segment and a cervical nerve. This is C2 spinal nerve, and we can see that the C2 spinal nerve will originate here, and so that would be the C2 segment of the spinal cord. That's not too bad for cervical and thoracic, but when we come down to like lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, the pattern is not going to be as easy. So let's say we take the L5 spinal nerve. We're actually going to have to follow that nerve up, and it's going to be a little bit higher up on the spinal cord. So the segment will be more superior than where the spinal nerve actually will exit out of the vertebral column. So just so you know. I do want to talk a little bit about how the spinal nerves will divide into rami or ramus. So here we have, on this diagram, you can see the spinal cord, and then here we have the spinal nerve proper over here. And what will happen is the spinal nerve will actually exit the intervertebral foramen, and immediately when it does so, it's going to split into rami. This one over here that's going to move more anteriorly is going to be the ventral ramus. And the ventral ramus is responsible for innervating the limbs and innervating the body wall that is more anterior. And over here we have the dorsal ramus. The dorsal ramus will go more posterior, and it will innervate the skin and muscles of the back. The gray ramus will actually branch into the white and gray ramus. This will, we're not going to go into too much detail of this, but they will attach to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and there will be some rearrangement of the neurons, so they can either go to muscles and be somatic, or they can go into the ventral cavity and be visceral neurons, so there will be some reorganization. But for our purposes, what I really would like you to know is that once the spinal nerve exits the intervertebral foramen, it's going to split into the dorsal ramus and into the ventral ramus. Now that we went over the gross anatomy of the spinal cord, we're going to look at the sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. So what we have done here is we've taken a transverse cross-section of the spinal cord, and we're looking at the cut end, and we're going to kind of study the different features that we can see when we see the cut end of the spinal cord. We talked about in chapter 12 that the central nervous system is going to have gray and white matter. And here you can see the two regions of gray and white matter. This over here, this butterfly shape, is going to be gray matter, and it's going to be a collection of cell bodies and non-myelinated axons. And so many interneurons, excuse me, are going to be located here. And the purpose of this region is really to integrate information and allow neurons to synapse with each other. When we get into studying pathways, the ascending and descending pathways, we'll talk about this integration in a little bit more detail. We can also see white matter over here. The white matter is going to be composed of bundles of axons known as tracts, and this will carry information up and down the spinal cord, connecting this central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. Ascending tracts are going to contain sensory information, while descending tracts are going to contain motor information. And one more important factor about this white matter is that the white matter is going to be organized so that certain regions of the white matter is going to be associated with certain regions of the body. So anything that is kind of going to the arms and is going to be responsible for fine motor control, well, those neurons will be all collected together in a particular location. This is really important clinically because it can help us understand if the spinal cord gets damaged and there are certain symptoms associated with that damage. Those symptoms can help us pinpoint where that damage is occurring within the spinal cord. So it can be really a useful tool to understand how the spinal cord is divided up regionally and what regions associate with the body. Okay, we are then going to have horns. So if we look at the gray matter is going to have 3 horns. It's going to have the dorsal horn or posterior gray horn. You can use both terms, that would be fine. You have the lateral horn right here. And then you have the ventral horn or anterior gray horn located here. We'll see that the posterior gray horn or the dorsal gray horn is going to be responsible for bringing in sensory information. The lateral gray horn is going to be responsible for visceral motor information, while the anterior gray horn or the ventral gray horn is going to be responsible for somatic motor information. Note that the lateral gray horn isn't going to always be present. It's going to just be present between T2 and L1. So this pattern is not consistent as we travel through different segments of the spinal cord. This butterfly shape will change depending on what nerves are coming in and out of the spinal cord. These two sides are actually going to be connected by a commissure. There is a little bridge that bridges the right and left side of the spinal cord. And interneurons and different motor and sensory neurons can cross over at this commissure, allowing for communication between the two sides and allowing for the information to be sensed contralaterally. We are going to have different columns or funiculi in the spinal cord. We have the posterior funiculus or dorsal funiculus, anterior funiculus or ventral funiculus, and lateral funiculus. These are where the axons are going to be located, and these will separate into tracts. These funiculi will be further subdivided into unique tracts that will carry specific information up and down the spinal cord. A little bit more about the sectional anatomy. There is going to be a set of grooves. There's going to be a set of grooves. There's going to be the posterior median sulcus. You can also call it the dorsal median sulcus, which is going to be here. It's going to be rather shallow, so that's why we just call it a sulcus. Over here is the anterior or ventral median sulcus. This one is going to be much deeper and is going to, not sulcus, I apologize. Anterior median fissure or ventral median fissure. It's a much deeper groove, so that's why we give it the distinction of a fissure. The sulcus is going to be shallow and the fissure is going to be deeper. And these will actually separate the right and left sides of the spinal cord. We are going to have different roots. Over here, we're going to have the dorsal root over here, and sensory information is going to travel through the dorsal root. I always remember dorsal and sensory both have S in the name, so it helps me keep that organized. Here we're going to have the ventral root. Ventral root is going to carry motor information and and specifically, I remember ventral and motor both have T in the name, so that's what helps me keep track of that. This is the dorsal root ganglion. This is where the cell bodies of the sensory nerves are actually going to be located, right here. And then the dorsal side and the ventral side will fuse together to form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is mixed. It's going to contain both motor and sensory information. And the last feature I would like you to be familiar with is the central canal. The central canal is going to be right in the center over here, and it's going to go down the full length of the spinal cord. This is actually a remnant of embryonic development. Remember, the brain starts as a hollow neural tube, and so this is a continuation of that neural tube, and it will directly connect to the ventricles that are in the brain. Here's a little bit of a bigger picture if you want to go through them in a little bit more detail. So you'll be able to see the gray matter and the white matter, the three horns, the three funiculi, the dorsal root and the ventral root, the dorsal root ganglion, and the spinal nerve. Notice the spinal nerve is actually splitting into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus here. So I do want to go into a little bit about how neurons are integrated in the gray matter of the spinal cord, what neurons travel where, and kind of just have a better understanding of that. I do have this written here, but I would like to go to a larger image to be able to represent this kind of figure. So over here, what we're going to have, just to orient ourselves, is we have the spinal cord. This side is going to be more dorsal or posterior. This side is going to be more anterior or more ventral. Here we have the spinal nerve, the dorsal root ganglion, the dorsal root. Here we have the ventral root, and inside the spinal cord we have the dorsal horn or the posterior gray horn, the lateral lateral gray horn, and the anterior or ventral gray horn. And here in these different colors, we're going to have different types of nerves. Blue is going to represent somatic sensory neurons, so that's going to come from the skin and the skeletal muscles. Visceral sensory neurons, which are coming from anything in the ventral cavity. Visceral motor neurons that are going to stimulate muscles and glands in the ventral cavity. And somatic motor neurons, which are going to stimulate skeletal muscles. So let's look at how this integration occurs. So sensory neurons, both somatic and visceral, are going to come through the spinal nerve, and their cell bodies are going to be located in the dorsal root ganglion. Their axons are going to continue on through the dorsal root, and they will end in the dorsal horn. This kind of tip of the dorsal horn is going to process somatic sensory information, while more of the base of the dorsal horn will process visceral sensory information. Here you can see these neurons, these sensory neurons are synapsing with interneurons within the gray matter. Oops. These interneurons will synapse with motor neurons, or these sensory neurons will directly synapse with motor neurons. And the motor neurons are going to arise either in the lateral horn or the ventral or anterior horn. The lateral horn is going to give rise to the ventral motor neurons, and this is where the cell bodies of the motor neurons are going to be located. So the lateral horn gives rise to this visceral motor neurons. The somatic motor neurons are going to arise from the ventral horn or the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And both of these neurons are going to leave through the ventral root and through the spinal nerve. So notice that the dorsal root is going to be carrying sensory information. Dorsal, sensory, both have an S in it. And then over here, ventral and motor both have a T in it. So that's how I help remember. And spinal nerves are going to be mixed. They're going to contain both sensory and motor information. So that's going to be showing how nerves are integrating with each other and where these nerves are arising and where their cell bodies are located. You can see that this really follows the same pattern that we learned about when we talked about somatic sensory reflexes. Just like the brain is protected, the spinal cord is going to be protected as well, and is going to be protected using bone, meninges, the blood-brain barrier, and cerebral spinal fluid, just as the brain is. And so this diagram is just trying to illustrate the meninges. So again, we're going to have the pia mater be directly touching the spinal cord and following the curve of the spinal cord. And remember, pia mater means gentle mother. It's going to give the spinal cord a nice little hug. The next layer, the more superficial layer we have, is the arachnoid mater. And the arachnoid mater is going to have those trabeculae, those spider web-like structures, connecting itself to the pia mater. And this space is going to have the subarachnoid space, which is going to contain the cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid will also be going through the central canal of the spinal cord. The other structure we're going to have is we're going to have the dura mater. There's only going to be one layer of dura mater surrounding the spinal cord. Remember, the brain actually had two layers. The spinal cord only has a single layer. Remember, the dura mater is a tough mother. It's going to be strong, and it's going to be made out of very dense fibrous connective tissue. And over here you can see the vertebra. Some different spaces that are of interest is we have the subarachnoid space. Because the subarachnoid space contains the cerebral spinal fluid, clinically we can do a spinal tap, and we can actually put a needle into the subarachnoid space and collect some of that cerebral spinal fluid. That can be used to help us to identify different infections, especially if there's meningitis. Meningitis is an infection and inflammation of the meninges. This can lead to a very severe headache and stiffening of the neck, but it can be very dangerous if not taken care of. And so sometimes meningitis can either be viral or bacterial. And a spinal tap can actually help us determine what type of infection that meningitis is. There also is the epidural space, epi meaning around or upon. That is going to be outside of the dura mater and in deep to the vertebrae, and it's going to be filled with a lot of fat that's cushioning the area. The epidural space is where the epidural can be given to during childbirth to help numb the nerves and limit the numb the tracts, to limit the propagation of action potentials and ease pain during labor. Okay. Thank you. That is our lecture about the spinal cord. In the next video, we're going to start part 3, where we're going to talk about ascending and descending pathways, or sensory and motor pathways. So there we'll be able to integrate our information about neural integration, and we'll kind of apply that in more details. Have a wonderful day and be good to yourself. Bye-bye.